do you want from me? Why don't you run from me? What are you wanting?
Hello lovelies, before we get into today's book, check out this cool new dice box I got from Mrs. Grimm. It's a dragon egg. And you unscrew it, though it's pretty seamless. And then you have dice inside. Pretty cool. Probably not one I'm gonna transport with me, but I'll keep some very nice dice in there. There we go. Right, today we are looking at Warlord Ascendant, Skirmish rules in the world of sacrifice. And because I am a contrarian soul, I am looking at this before I've even looked at sacrifice. So I can't tell you much about the world. So this is mostly going to be about rules. So this is another Alex T and Blackoath product. It is a fairly slim A5 volume at just over 100 pages. There's a tables index, but I did feel that despite being a relatively small book, this really could have done with a more full-on index rather than a table of contents and an index of tables, because no matter how simple the war game, it is useful to be able to reference very specific rules and so on should you need them during play. So that's an immediate criticism, which isn't a nice way to start, but there you go. It's not too bad because it is such a relatively slim volume, but it is important when you're playing PvP type stuff, which most war games and skirmish games are. So yeah, this is a skirmish game rather than a war game. I would place it roughly on par with the original Warhammer 40k edition, except that you're dealing with even smaller warbands here, so perhaps a bit more like the very light sort of skirmish gang games, whose names have just vanished from my head. There's the fantasy one where the warpstone has fallen on the city, and there's the one with the gangs underneath the hive cities. It'll come to me like at middle of lunch or something, and I'll go, aha, I sound like an idiot. But you know the ones I mean if you're at all familiar with 40k and so on. So yeah, this is more at that sort of scale, perhaps even smaller, which means that the troops that you have a certain amount of character to them. There's a bit more bookkeeping, but it's not complicated in the way that war games, the way that role-playing games typically are, but nor is it as simple as most war games typically are. Different characters can have different special capabilities and so on, and so keeping track of that, it's a good idea to keep things small. Everything is centered around a warband. There are various factions of humans for the most part. So you start with maybe 5 troops. So you have your warband leader, a couple of intermediary troops, and a couple of very basic troops. And each of them has a stat block. These scores are basically the bonuses that you would get in most standard D20 type OSR type things. So translation is relatively easy, but not especially straightforward. Having some conversion rules and so on would have been something very useful to have, to turn this into a more sort of generally applicable set of small-scale skirmish rules, which would have been nice to have, but it's not that difficult to customize things and make them work a little better for you. Obviously, there's a concentration on the physical stats, while everything else is pretty much wrapped up into a single stat called Spirit. Loyalty obviously determines how loyal they are to you. Speed's pretty obvious. Upkeep is, I think, the cost to keep them in the style to which they're accustomed and to keep them part of your group. And there's a cost related to recruitment. Different troops obviously have different stat lines. The amount of health points essentially that they have is a multiple of their constitution, and they have special abilities. In addition to special abilities, taking something from more modern war games perhaps, you have command actions that you can spend to create certain bonuses while you're skirmishing with someone else. So different troops have different capabilities, different types of warband have different command actions, and so it goes. Now, not having read Sacrifice, I can't tell you too much about the various individual factions, but they do get a brief sort of overview. And it would be relatively easy to convert any sort of odds and ends miniatures that you might have into this sort of thing. You know, now my main points of comparison are probably Warmer Hordes or War Machine, if you prefer, and a very old school 40k. Now, very old school 40k, you were rolling 6-sided dice, so a bonus, whatever it might be, was a pretty big deal then, because you're increasing your chances quite a lot, right? If you're hitting on a 6 and then you're hitting on a 5 or 6, it's a big leap. You know, so what is it? Roughly 14% per point on a d6, I think. So using a d20 here, these bonus levels are relatively small, and that to me makes it seem like essentially it comes down to whoever rolls the highest on a d20, almost regardless which troop is fighting which troop. So until your warbands have developed up a few levels and their stats have changed, the major determiner of how a battle is going to go is much more about the commands and the special capabilities than it is necessarily the statistics per se. So yeah, it feels like it's very swingy and unpredictable in a lot of ways, in a way that I didn't necessarily particularly like. Like a lot of old school games, the kinds of bonuses that you're adding also feel pretty low to me, compared even to 5th edition. If you consider 5th edition, you know, at a stat of 20 you're getting +5, right? At an 18, which is more reachable perhaps, we're talking a +4, right? And then on top of that you have your proficiency bonuses, and anything else that factors in, which makes it a lot less swingy and means a troop's expertise and so on, if you were to try and translate it into this system, would be a lot more predictable, a lot more effective and a lot more meaningful. I don't know why so many old school games constrict the bonuses from 1 to 3. I know it's legacy of older product, but I just find it kind of unsatisfying. But that's on me, I guess. You get combat maneuvers and so on as well that are open to almost anybody depending on the thing, and then you get the specialist maneuvers. Difficulty levels are going to be familiar to anyone who's familiar with any D20 game, but then again the bonuses are relatively small, so yeah, it nicks the advantage disadvantage rule. There are critical successes and failures, but they have atypical effects, perhaps. You have phases, so you kind of manage your warband, recruit new people, upkeep the people you've got. If you expand your group, you're going to have to take riskier jobs and win more battles in order to upkeep everyone. At the end of missions, skirmishes, whatever, you may gain treasure or items or so on, or you may encounter wandering NPCs who will give you stuff. The whole thing takes place in something called No Man's Land, which presumably is a battleground between various states. Again, I haven't read Sacrifice yet, so not necessarily hugely helpful on my part, but this took my fancy to read first. So yeah, it is a small sort of skirmish game of the ilk of those Games Workshop low-level skirmish games with gang development and so on that we've talked about earlier, and whose names are still escaping me. Let's begin with a C. Mordheim is one of them. Okay, and since this is a fantasy game, let's reference Mordheim. Yeah, so it's kind of an even lighter sort of Mordheim set in the Sacrifice world. Now, I like those kind of skirmish games. I remember the original sci-fi one being published in White Dwarf before I gave up my subscription. You can also run into all kinds of monsters, which is fun. Again, you can see the statistic lines aren't hugely differentiated, so that still leaves it pretty swingy. So like trolls have a constitution of 3, but a variation of 1 to 3 on a scale of 20 really isn't that much. So yeah, that would be my major criticism, I think, of this, is that it is so relatively random, to the point where skill and statistics don't necessarily matter that much, which makes it more to do with luck than the quality of the troops or even the orders and stuff that you put in, than anything else. So I would kind of expand out that scale if I were designing this, or if I were converting things to use the same system, because the underlying bones of the system all seem fine to me if you want to do this sort of thing. Actually, another point of reference would be Anno Domini 1666, which similarly uses a system that is largely derived from old school OSR type mechanics or familiar D&D type mechanics, and does have smaller warbands and so on in it. And I love Anno Domini. It's a very fun game. Alright, so what do we have here? A slim volume, A5, 100 pages or so, containing a pretty adaptable low-level skirmish game of the ilk of Anno Domini or Mordheim, easily adapted to pretty much any other OSR-derived game you want, so there's a lot of usefulness there. Could have done with some conversion rules, I think. Perhaps more will become apparent when I read Sacrifice. Style-wise, it's the usual Alex T kind of black metal style, less colourful than 1,000 Dead Worlds. The art is functional, reasonably evocative, but I think this is intended very much as a supplement to Sacrifice. I was coming at it thinking, oh, this might make a good sort of generic skirmish rule set for OSR games, which it kind of does. So the artwork's okay. Perhaps I would have gone a little bit more art punk if I was doing this, but then skirmish games, war games, it's imperative even that they be readable. So perhaps not. So overall, style-wise, Right, so accessibility and referenceability, that would normally be more of a substance issue, but here I think it is more of a style issue. So 3 for style. It does what it needs to, but it's let down a little bit by not having a decent index, and it would be nice to have more and better reference pages in the back, so that you could, once you were familiar with the rules, just play from a couple of pages in the back. That would be super useful. You can't particularly. In terms of substance then, I mean, this is a fully featured skirmish rule set within that world. It's all there. It's just the organization that kind of lets it down a little bit. This is a nice sort of throwback to those sorts of games that were more sort of general toolkits, that are now kind of embodied in those sort of one-page rule set type things. But this is a nice sort of intermediary between all that. If you've got odd miniatures here and there that don't necessarily fit within one of the skirmish or war games that you play, then this might be a fun thing to add to your arsenal in order to be able to play with those minis and make up your own world and your own rules. The main thing I would say that would improve this massively would be a set of conversion rules, and just expanding out the bonuses to make it slightly less swingy. Going from a range of +1 to +3 to +1 to +5 would make the world of difference to the game overall, in my not so humble opinion. So yeah, I'll give it a 4 for substance. So 3 for style, 4 for substance. That is 7 out of 10. That is 3.5 out of 5, slightly above average. If you're looking for an OSR set of skirmish rules, not a bad idea. If you play Sacrifice and you want to quickly model little battles or whatever, gang fights, things like that, on your tabletop, then also a very good bet. I don't know that it'll have much broader appeal beyond that, but there is a reasonably solid rule set behind all this that could be easily adapted to other things, other genres, other game settings, and so on. It just needs some robust conversion rules, and that would bump it up even more. Sang.
Machinations of the Space Princess is an old-school RPG with a sci-fi setting. The rules are familiar and at once innovative. Opened up so you can play literally any alien species you can envision. Purchase it at RPG Now or Lulu.com.